So I was driving across the country the other day, and you know how sometimes you'll find in bathroom stalls and whatnot Christian outreach tracts, gospel tracts, chick tracts maybe, and they share the basic message of salvation. Well, I found one of those with a creative twist. I found an atheist tract. It's called Christianity 10 Painful Facts. And when I looked through them, I thought, man, I kind of want to respond to these. Each of these is so short-sighted and kind of deserves a response. Stuff like this is now showing up in unsuspecting places, so we should be ready to counter it. All right, painful fact number one. The dating of Mark. The earliest gospel, Mark, was written over a generation 40 years after the alleged death of Jesus. So it can't possibly be communicating true, good historical data if it's 40 years after. So two problems here. First, yes, it can still demonstrate proper historical facts even if it's 40 years after. There's still living eyewitnesses at the time. There's still local people, local stories, oral tradition, keeping things very much alive. So even if Mark was written in 70 plus AD, which they're claiming here, it would still be a high quality historical document. Think of Josephus. This guy's writing, I think around 90 AD, and he's writing all of this Jewish history. Nobody doubts the quality of the history that Josephus writes, even though a lot of what he's writing about is centuries earlier. So facts of history don't change decades later. What we need to know is, like, are these based on reliable sources? And the second problem with that one is that no, it wasn't 40 years after that Mark was being written. The most liberal scholars, they'll say, yeah, the New Testament was written between 70 and 100 AD. I've had students Google that before, and they're like, yeah, New Testament was written 70 to 100 AD. No, almost all the New Testament was written before 70 AD. Here's why we can know that. The Apostle Paul is known to have died in Nero's persecutions, 66, 67, somewhere in there. Other apostles died even earlier than that. So the writings of Peter are before that time. The writings of Paul are before that time. And also the book of Luke. Luke's a traveling companion of Paul. His gospel is partly based on Paul, mostly based on other eyewitnesses, thought to be the third gospel. Okay, the book of Luke, its sequel is the book of Acts, the second account, and this chronicles the ministry of the apostles, including, well, mostly focused on Peter and Paul. First half Peter, second half Paul. And it ends before Paul makes it to Rome. So it ends at like 62 AD. All right, so nothing in Acts is written after that point. And also a huge historical moment, the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Nothing in the New Testament records that. Maybe some cryptic stuff in Revelation suggests some of that stuff going on. So most think John and Revelation were written after that. But even these historical books, which Acts would have recorded, does not record the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. In fact, it ends about 62 AD as Paul is on his way to Rome. So if Luke is ending at 62 AD, then the prequel to Luke came before it. That makes sense. That would be, year 60, maybe earlier. And pretty much everyone agrees Matthew and Mark were before that. There's a little bit of disagreement about which was actually first. In either case, we're into the 50s AD when Mark and Matthew were written. So it's factually incorrect on that point. It's also, even if it is correct that it's written later, that doesn't change the events of history just because it's written later. It still meets the test of historical criteria. All right, fact number two. It says 612 of the 662 verses in the Gospel of Mark can be found in Matthew, largely in the same order, etc., etc. So I had a comparison that I made about the story of John the Baptist. A lot of similar language. They describe John the Baptist the same basic way in those passages, although the order of the verses is mixed up a little bit and some of the wording is changed. We do see that, yeah, there is a lot of commonality between Matthew and Mark. Is that a problem? Not necessarily. I mean, Matthew and Mark could be exact parallel accounts, and that's all that tells you is that they wrote the same things, or maybe one did copy from the other. So even if it's the case, which it's not because of the frequent wording differences and different stories and different emphases that they both have, but even if they were sharing the exact same account, it doesn't make it untrue. So it just doesn't logically follow that would lead to that. And the number, though, that 92%, I think Mark's verses are found in Matthew, that's a little misleading. It's saying that the story in Mark is also seen in Matthew. The wording is different. Right? The style of Mark is much different from the style of Matthew. Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience. He extrapolates more. He gives more details most of the time. Sometimes Mark gives more details. Mark 14 has more details than parallel accounts. So it's not always the case. And it's though if one expounds beyond the other and the other also expounds beyond that, then it looks like they're just not reliant on each other. So some have assumed there's a common document called a Q document, a common source at least. And I'm kind of with N.T. Wright that I think the Q document is probably the oral tradition. These apostles are practicing reciting these stories, these gospel accounts before they write them down. And so if they're in close quarters, they're going to be sharing a lot of the same stories and carrying a lot of the same memories into their gospel accounts. So they don't necessarily rely on each other, but maybe there's a common tradition before them, probably an oral tradition that leads them to write a lot of the same stories. Because they're not the same gospel. They're very different. They're very unique. The goal appears to be kind of different. They both want to glorify Jesus and to describe the gospel, of course, but the target audience is different. The style is very different. So it's not the same document twice. You want to find that, you got to open the Book of Mormon to 2nd and 3rd Nephi. Then you'll really see what plagiarized stories look like. Entire chapters copied word for word out of the King James Bible included into the Book of Mormon. All right, that's plagiarism. That's not two different reports. Two different reports is going to give you the same story, sometimes a lot of the same quotes, but from two different angles. So when that spy balloon thing came over the United States, you had multiple newspapers sharing that story, and they had a lot of things in common. So having things in common in the story is not evidence that the story didn't happen, right? It just means that they got some of the same information at different news agencies. I think we get some of that same sort of thing. So painful fact number 1 and 2, both dealing with the Gospel of Mark, interestingly. So fact number 3, also dealing with the Gospel, says the Gospels were written by anonymous authors and later falsely attributed to authors who did not write them, nor were these anonymous authors eyewitnesses. And then it points you to the ending of John and the beginning of Luke to show that they were not eyewitnesses. Interestingly, both of those passages do say that these Gospels are reliant on eyewitness testimony, so that kind of backfires on them a little bit. So are the Gospels anonymous? In a sense, they don't open up their letter the same way Paul would open up his letter and say, Paul to the church at so-and-so. So how do we know who wrote these Gospels? Well, church fathers, generally. I mentioned Papias earlier, and he's the first line of disciples of John, Papias, Irenaeus, Polycarp. So there's uniformity with these guys that Matthew wrote this first gospel. Mark, using Peter's account, wrote his gospel. Luke investigated other eyewitnesses and wrote his gospel. And John, later on, a disciple of Jesus, wrote his. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, if these are going to be forgeries that the church just wants to use, then they ought to go with the more popular names. But what we have is two apostles, Matthew and John, and then two companions of apostles with Mark and Luke. So it doesn't look like there's foul play going on with that. Plus, read the Gospels. That would be an initial test. Read the Gospels and see, does this read like a story of somebody that's just kind of telling stories that are third-hand, fourth-hand information, or does this sound like somebody who was there, who knew and saw these things happen? And I would argue most of the stories you see in the Gospels, if not all the stories, sounds like this is based on somebody who was present, who saw these things happen. So even in the case of Luke, who's a reputable, great historian. Ending of John, same kind of way. And John is interesting because he writes his gospel without including his own name as one of the apostles. So all the other gospels are mentioning John by name, and then you come to this fourth gospel and it doesn't mention John by name. I mean, it seems pretty clear just from that, okay, that's because John is the one writing it. Will later call himself the disciple who Jesus loved. And plus some of the stories that happen in the book of John could have only been Peter, James, or John seeing those things. So really good evidence that John wrote the book of John. It can also look at parallels in John's letters. Some of the things that are said in the gospel have these similar wordings that aren't really seen other places in the New Testament. Wordings found in the book of John. So John wrote the book of John. It should be pretty easy to figure out. I think it is. Matthew is not a name that you're just going to forge in there. But that's relying on the church fathers to know that it was Matthew that wrote Matthew. Mark, again, not a name you're going to forge in there. But writing Peter's account, traveling companion of Peter, according to the book of Acts. And then Luke, this physician, historian, traveling companion of Paul, another name you're just not going to forge into there. So we have good reason to think that these were the guys. Three of them probably eyewitnesses. Luke, I wouldn't doubt if he was an eyewitness to some of the things, but made his accounts based on multiple attestations. Again, applying logic to it, though, it still doesn't say that it's not true, even if the writers were not eyewitnesses, like in Luke's case. If we take Luke to be completely a random person who didn't see any of the things happen. It could be written by non-eyewitnesses and still be true. After all, a lot of what we know about our world is not based on eyewitness testimony. My example is a tornado ripped through town. It didn't happen, really, but say a tornado ripped through town. How would I know that? It's very unlikely that I was the eyewitness of the tornado, right? But the news can report it. I can talk to friends who saw it. I could have seen it in the forecast. I could have felt part of that storm that could generate things like that. And I could go out and see the aftermath of what happened. So in none of these cases am I the direct eyewitness to the events, and yet I would still have very good reason to believe that a tornado ripped through town. Similarly with the events of Jesus' life, even if somebody were to write an account that wasn't an eyewitness, they could still gather enough information, especially so close to that location, close to the time that it happened, and be able to conclude rationally that, yes, in fact, there are good reasons to believe these things happened. All right. So far, the first three, even if they're true, the Gospels could still be completely true and valid. But they're also very misleading in their information. So fact number 4, the Gospels contain numerous forgeries, contradictions, and errors. It's so brief, it doesn't actually mention any of the errors that it alleges here. It just says that there are many. You can go to websites and look at them. I've spent way too much time probably looking at different alleged errors in the Gospels. And the word forgeries is kind of snuck in there. That's a misleading one too. So forgery would be when you paint a painting that's made to look like the authentic Da Vinci or whatever, and then you take it to auction, try to sell it like it's a masterpiece when it's a forgery. right? Is that what we see with the writings of the Gospels? Not really. But again, this one has a logic flaw in it too. This one would be a little more hurtful to the cause, but to know that there's forgeries in there, you would have to know what the authentic looked like. So that's kind of odd. The authentic is very well attested now in the manuscript evidence, and it doesn't look like there's any drastic changes that have happened. There's a lot of little changes happening here and there. There's certain places where we don't know where the wording is this or this, but in general, we have the full text of the New Testament scriptures in the manuscript tradition, and we know that. But I suspect that what they mean by the forgeries here are the two sections that we possess in our Bibles that are not in the earliest manuscript tradition, and that's John 8:53 or John 7:53 to 8:11, and the longer ending of Mark. Each 12 verses, I think, and that might be what they mean by forgeries. But there's nothing in those accounts that is really groundbreaking or seems to be pushing any sort of agenda, unless you want to consider snake handling to be a big part of the Christian agenda at that time. But that's just a recent development. So if those two are the forgeries they're talking about, Christian scholars are admitting those, and they don't have a problem with that. It's an issue because we have to keep them in the Bibles at this point, but also put it in brackets and admit, hey, this probably isn't original to the text of John and Mark. And as far as contradictions, I don't know what they're talking about here, but there are a few that are commonly brought up. Was there one angel at the tomb or two angels at the tomb after Jesus' resurrection? Well, let's remember what a contradiction is. A contradiction is when two claims cannot possibly be true at the same time in the same sense. So if I had a glass of water yesterday and I had a soda yesterday, is it not true that I could have had both? Right? If there's an angel at the tomb and someone else says there's two angels at the tomb, is it possible that there's both? Yes. An angel also could imply more than just that angel, just that it mentions the one. That's just in general what we need to do with contradictions. You read it in context, ask the questions, can both of these be true at the same time? What do we do with this? And I've come across other challenging passages. A lot of times it's based on a translational difficulty. What is prois as early in the morning at the resurrection morning? One says, well, it's still dark. One says it's daybreak. All right, well, we've just got a translational difficulty. We've got this space of time very early in the morning that we don't quite know how to describe it. So here's the word, and there's not an exact parallel in English sometimes. Sometimes it's that. Sometimes it's what's the goal of the author? What's he trying to portray? Is this actually the same event? And then is one reporting particulars while another is trying to be a little more exhaustive? And then reading it in context. Generally, after you do that for a few minutes, and I've seen it with my high school students, after you do that for a few minutes, you kind of get past the accusation that there's a contradiction there. So fact number 4, again, the Gospels contain numerous forgeries, contradictions, and errors. It's not a forgery. A forgery is trying to make something look valuable when it's really not. And that's not at all what we see in the Gospel. So a very misleading term on fact number 4. All right, fact number 5. There are no first century witnesses outside of the corrupt and biased Gospels that attest to the earthly existence of Jesus Christ. And then it mentions the forgery of Josephus. So it's like nobody mentions it. Oh, but this guy mentions it. And that's another point where there's multiple manuscripts of Josephus, and one of the manuscripts has is apparently inserted information. Maybe Christians got a hold of it and saw what Josephus was saying about Jesus, and they said, yeah, you're undervaluing who Jesus is, and so they add some words in. If it be right to call him a man, a miracle worker. But Josephus definitely mentions Jesus, and that's before the close of the century. And there's other people. There's Pliny the Younger, Tacitus, Suetonius, that mention Jesus from very early on. But let's also point out the circular reasoning that's on here. It's like saying nobody mentions Jesus except for these people that mention Jesus. The corrupt and biased sources. All right, they're not corrupt. That's circular reasoning. That's begging the question. And biased sources, as if they want to say there is no gospel account other than the gospel account. Gotcha, Christians. We read about the spy balloon that went across the United States from American sources, right? Does that mean it didn't happen because America had an interest in pointing out what happened with his spy balloon that was shot down? No. In fact, I would say that the people closest to Jesus would have the best information about him. If we're going to look at a biography of Abraham Lincoln, who are you going to go to? Somebody that had no interest in Abraham Lincoln, or somebody who was extremely close to him and had great interest in retelling his story? Probably the person that was close to him. You call him biased, but we all have biases, and this is horrendously biased to the point that it's drastically skewed historical facts and what's actually contained in the Bible and in church history. So there are witnesses, again, factually wrong, and even if it is true, consequences are minimal. But there are first century eyewitnesses, and even if there weren't, the story, we would still have good reason to believe that everything about Jesus is true, as it says in the Bible. And let's also remember that the Bible is not a single source. Right? We've got 8 or 9 different writers, and the central point of the Bible, of the New Testament, is Jesus' life, death, resurrection. So that's attested by Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and then we've got Paul, and we've got Peter and James, we've got the author of Hebrews, and Jude, and I think Revelation was the same John. But not to mention all of the verbal communication that was going on, sharing this information. Not everybody was writing. Not a lot of people could get their hands on what it took to write or had the patience to write. And even if they did write, it's going to be hard to get that writing to spread. There's also Clement, another Christian source writing in the first century, writing about Jesus. So it wouldn't have been great interest writing about Jesus if it wasn't the believers either. I know the Gnostics write about him later. The non-Christian sources just kind of have an interest about what do we do with this guy? He's challenging. I don't know how to confront this Jesus movement thing. That's kind of the nature that they're sharing. But given the type of life that Jesus had, we wouldn't expect people to be wanting to write about him left and right from Rome. Right? That's kind of where the authority is. In Rome, what interest did they have in writing about Jesus? He wasn't a political figure. He wasn't threatening to overthrow Rome. He didn't live in the capital city. He wasn't particularly rich. And so we wouldn't expect much to be written about him, especially in those times. So what we do have is quite staggering. The 8 or 9 authors of the New Testament, and then the several within the first 100 years that are non-Christians that wrote about him also. So all we have is information about the life that Jesus lived, attesting to the miracles and the teachings and the death and resurrection. We don't have anything contrary to that from anywhere near that time. So no first century witnesses, the accusation here. Remember what they're trying to do. 10 painful facts against Christianity. It's saying we shouldn't believe in Jesus. All right, not too impressed with this. The logic doesn't line up, and the facts are pretty well twisted. So Hopefully this gets you thinking a little bit in the right direction and can continue to increase your confidence that Christianity is true. The events recorded in Scripture actually happened, and it is reasonable to put your trust in Jesus. So until next time, I'm Evan Van Sickle. Enjoy your day. Go live the truth.